The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of pale gold beneath a cruel sun. Each gust of wind rolled up a curtain of dust that bit into the eyes and teeth, dry and unrelenting. Somewhere along that lonely stretch of land, a man named Eli Turner rode his tired mare toward the dying light. He'd been ranching these parts for 12 years, long enough to know that the desert had two moods, silence and death. By sundown, Eli's shadow stretched across the land like a ghost. He was only a few miles from his ranch when he noticed something unusual: buzzards circling low over a dry arroyo. He tugged the reins, squinting into the dust. Usually, that meant a carcass, maybe a coyote, maybe a steer. But this time, something else called to him, a strange instinct. He dismounted, boots crunching over the brittle ground, and followed the winged scavengers. The air was thick, silent, save for the faint creak of leather and the whisper of sand sliding off the rocks. Then he saw her, a young native girl, maybe 16, lay half buried in dust, her breathing shallow, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her clothes were torn, her skin bruised by the merciless sun. Beside her, a broken bow and a snapped arrow, Apache craftsmanship. Eli froze. Every rancher in Arizona territory knew what this meant. Helping her could bring vengeance. Leaving her could mean death by guilt. The girl's eyes fluttered open, dark, terrified eyes that met his. She tried to speak, but managed only a rasp. Water. Eli's hand trembled as he reached for his canteen. "Easy there," he murmured, tilting the water to her lips. She drank, coughed, then reached weakly toward the horizon, whispering a word he couldn't understand. It sounded like Tashunk, maybe a name, maybe a warning. He glanced toward the hills. No sign of riders. Not yet. He carried her in his arms, light as a shadow, burning with fever, and laid her across his horse. The mare snorted, uneasy. He knew she could smell fear and blood. By the time Eli reached his ranch, the sky had turned to bruised purple. Coyotes howled in the distance. He pushed open the cabin door with his shoulder and laid the girl on his bed. He soaked a rag in cold water, wiped the dust from her face, and prayed no one had seen him bring her in. He'd heard stories. Settlers who helped wounded Apaches, only to wake with their barns burned and families slaughtered. But looking at her now, barely clinging to life, Eli felt something he hadn't felt in years. "Mercy," he whispered to her, though she couldn't hear him. "You'll be safe here tonight, Miss. I promise." Outside, the wind had changed. It carried a new scent, smoke. Not from his chimney. Eli stepped out onto the porch. In the distance, faint flickers of fire dotted the horizon like stars being born in the wrong sky. He knew what that meant. Somewhere out there, 300 Apache riders were lighting their war fires, and he had just taken in one of their own. He swallowed hard, staring into the red dusk. The desert was silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the quiet before the storm. The desert night came sudden and cold. The stars stretched across the black sky like shards of ice, and Eli Turner could feel the weight of silence pressing against his cabin walls. Inside, the girl slept, if sleep could be called that. Her breath came shallow, uneven, like the rasp of dry leaves. Eli sat by the window, Winchester rifle resting on his knee. He had bolted the doors, barred the shutters, and doused the lamps, leaving only the weak glow of embers in the stove. Outside, the wind hissed softly, stirring up whispers that sounded too much like voices. He kept telling himself he'd done the right thing. You couldn't just leave her out there, Eli. But every time he looked at her, the dark braids, the beads around her neck, the faint red paint still clinging to her face, the knot in his stomach tightened. He'd seen Apache scouts before, fast, silent, deadly, and if they found her here, they wouldn't ask questions. A faint sound broke the stillness, a soft groan. Eli turned. The girl's eyes were open, reflecting the firelight like black glass. She tried to rise, but pain gripped her ribs, forcing her back. "Easy," Eli said, moving closer. "You're safe. No one's gonna hurt you." She blinked at him, confusion clouding her gaze. "You, white man," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Eli hesitated. "Name's Turner. Eli Turner. You're in my cabin. Found you near the arroyo." She winced, clutching her side. "They came at sunset. ... Soldiers. We ran soldiers." Eli leaned in. "You mean cavalry?" She nodded weakly. "They kill my brother." A tear slid down her cheek, carving a clean line through the dust. For a moment, Eli's chest ached with something he hadn't felt in a long time: pity. He fetched a damp cloth and laid it on her forehead. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as though the word itself was fragile. "Taya, Taya," he repeated softly. "You rest now. You'll need strength come morning." But as he said it, his eyes flicked to the window and froze. A faint glow on the horizon. Not the steady orange of a homestead fire. This one flickered, scattered. Many small points of light moving slowly across the dark. Eli's pulse began to hammer. He snatched up his spyglass from the mantel and aimed it toward the ridge torches. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. He cursed under his breath. They were coming. He grabbed his rifle, checked the rounds. Then he did what any man with a guilty conscience would do. He started counting his ammunition and his sins. Inside, Taya stirred again. "They come," she whispered, as if she could feel it in her bones. Eli turned toward her, sweat beading his brow. "Who? Your people?" She nodded faintly. "Apache, come for me. And for you." He swallowed hard, staring into the black distance where the torches burned brighter. The air carried faint drumbeats, slow, steady, heart-like. Boom, boom, boom. Each beat echoed across the canyon like the pulse of the desert itself. Eli took a deep breath. "All right," he muttered. "If they're coming, they'll find a man ready to talk. Or fight." He poured sand over the stove's coals, dimming the last of the light. Then he stepped out onto the porch, rifle across his shoulder. The wind whipped his coat as he stared out at the night fire glowing along the horizon. For the first time in 12 years, Eli Turner prayed. Not for forgiveness, but for dawn. The desert had never been so still. Even the coyotes had gone silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Eli Turner sat by the window, his rifle balanced across his knees, watching the orange lights flicker closer from the ridge. The faint sound of drums carried through the cold night air, slow, steady, and patient, like the ticking of an old clock counting down to something inevitable. Behind him, Taya stirred restlessly in her sleep. Every now and then, she murmured in her native tongue, words Eli couldn't understand, but somehow felt. He poured a small measure of whiskey into a tin cup, more for courage than warmth, and took a long swallow. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He'd been through gunfights, droughts, cattle raids, but nothing had ever chilled him like this silence between drumbeats. Suddenly, a soft thud came from outside hooves, slow, careful. Eli rose quietly and stepped to the door. Through a crack in the wood, he saw movement, shadows slipping between the fence posts. For a heartbeat, he counted 3 riders, maybe 4. Then another sound joined them, a low whistle, answered from somewhere far off in the dark. "They're scouting," Eli whispered to himself. Behind him came a weak voice. "Don't shoot." He turned. Taya was awake, propped up on one elbow, her face pale in the moonlight. "They watch," she said softly. "They test you." Eli frowned. "Test me? For what?" "To see if you fear them," she murmured. "If you raise your gun, they kill you before sunrise." He stared at her, torn between disbelief and instinct. "And if I don't?" "Then they wait. They watch. Apache never rush." Eli looked back out the window. The riders had melted into the shadows, leaving only the faint shimmer of torchlight in the far distance. For a moment, he considered running, saddling up and riding north through the canyon before dawn. But one look at Taya ended that thought. She wouldn't survive the ride, and leaving her behind wasn't something he could do anymore. He sat back down, exhaling slowly. "Why'd they let you live?" he asked quietly. "If the soldiers killed your brother, why didn't they take you?" Taya's eyes darkened. She looked away, her hands twisting the edge of the blanket. "I, not just Apache girl," she said finally. "My father." "Was chief?" Eli froze. "Your father." "Chief Kosa," she whispered. "He led the war bands near the White Mesa. I ran when soldiers came. He sent me to find peace talk with white men." She looked up at Eli then, eyes wet with exhaustion and anger. "But white men shot my brother instead." Eli's heart sank. He knew the name Chief Kosa, the war leader who'd burned 3 ranches the year before, after a treaty was broken. The man whose name settlers used to scare their children. "So that's why they're coming," Eli muttered. "Not just for you. For revenge." Taya's voice cracked. "No, they come for me. They think I dead, but if they find me here in your house, they kill you first." Eli's jaw tightened. He stood, walking to the window again. The torches on the ridge were brighter now, more of them, maybe 50, maybe 100. He could almost hear voices carried by the wind, soft, chanting, like the desert itself was warning him. He turned back toward Taya, his shadow stretching across the room. "Then we better make them believe you're still dead," he said quietly, "or we'll both be buried before the sun comes up." Outside, the drums grew louder. The fence creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, the first streaks of dawn broke across the horizon like blood on steel. The night drums had faded, but the desert was still humming with tension. Eli Turner hadn't slept a wink. He sat at the edge of his porch, watching the distant smoke rise from the hills where the Apache campfires had burned through the night. Inside the cabin, Taya stirred weakly. Her fever had broken, but her voice was faint, soft as wind through dry grass. "They are close," she murmured. "If they see me alive, they bring fire to your home." Eli rubbed his tired eyes. "You said they believe you dead, so maybe we make sure they keep thinking that." He looked out at the dirt yard, the horse corral, the endless dust stretching toward the canyon. We give them something to find. Before sunrise, Eli set to work. He dragged an old tarp from the barn, spread it over the ground near the corral, and sprinkled it with blood from a slaughtered calf. He burned the tarp's edges, then buried torn scraps of Taya's dress in the ashes. From a distance, it would look like a body burned and buried in haste, the mark of a man hiding his crime or erasing his mercy. Taya watched from the window, her eyes hollow. "You clever," she whispered. "But Apaches see truth in small things." Eli gave her a half smile. "Then I'll make the lie big enough to blind them." When the sun finally climbed over the ridge, the desert shimmered gold and cruel again. Eli stood outside, hat low, rifle slung across his back. He didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning they came. First, the sound hooves, dozens of them, echoing through the dry basin. Then figures appeared from the heat haze. Apache riders, painted for war, feathers and steel glinting under the rising sun. They moved like ghosts, silent, disciplined, a tide of red and brown cutting across the plain. Eli's pulse hammered in his ears. He stayed still, hands at his sides. The lead rider slowed to a halt at the edge of his fence, a tall man with a hawk feather in his hair and a face carved from stone. He raised a hand, and the others fanned out. Circling the ranch like wolves, Eli recognized him from old wanted posters and whispered tavern stories. Chief Kosa himself. The chief dismounted slowly, his eyes sweeping the yard. They landed on the burned patch of earth. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Kosa knelt, running his fingers through the ashes. He lifted a charred scrap of cloth and held it to the wind. Eli forced himself to speak. "Found her out there, near the arroyo," he said, voice steady but low. "She didn't make it. Buried her myself." Kosa's dark eyes rose to meet his. There was no anger in them, only a cold, measuring silence. "You burn her?" the chief asked in broken English. Eli nodded once. Didn't want coyotes tearing her apart. The chief studied him for another long, unbearable moment. Then he dropped the cloth and stood. Around him, his warriors shifted restlessly, gripping their rifles. One of them muttered something sharp in Apache, a question, maybe a doubt. Kosa raised his hand and barked a single word. The warrior fell silent. Then the chief turned his gaze back to Eli. "You lie, maybe," he said softly. "But you have no fear. Fear shows in eyes, yours, only tired." Eli didn't breathe. Finally, Kosa stepped back, signaling his riders. "We go. If you lie, Sky will tell me." And just like that, they mounted up and vanished into the horizon's glare. As quietly as they had come, Eli stood there long after the dust settled, the rifle heavy in his hands. When he turned back toward the cabin, Taya was watching him from the window, her face pale, her eyes wide. "You fool them," she whispered. Eli shook his head. "No, just bought us time." Far to the south, a single column of black smoke still rose into the sky, the kind that marked a warning, not a surrender. The sun fell behind the mesas like a dying ember, and the desert turned cold again. The stillness after the Apache's departure was almost worse than their presence. Eli Turner leaned against the porch post, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon long after the riders vanished. He had done it for now, but the quiet that followed was not peace. It was the weight of something unseen, circling him like a shadow. Inside, Taya sat up weakly, the color returning to her face. Her dark eyes followed him through the window as he poured himself a shot of whiskey. "You did good," she said softly. Eli shook his head. "Good don't count for much out here. Just keeps a man breathing another day." She hesitated. "You could have let me die." "Yeah," he muttered. "I could have." Eli looked at her, his face half hidden by the glow of the lamp. "'Cause I've seen enough dying to last a lifetime. Yours wouldn't VE made it any better." Taya lowered her gaze. For a long moment, only the crackle of the fire spoke. Then she said quietly, "When my father learns I live, he will come back." Eli sighed. "I figured as much." He poured another shot, but didn't drink it. "Maybe I'll tell him myself." Night deepened. A faint wind swept across the ranch, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and smoke. Eli checked the perimeter once more. "Just habit," he told himself, before settling by the fire. But as the clock struck midnight, something moved out in the darkness. A shadow detached itself from the desert's edge and began walking toward the ranch, slow, steady, no horse, no sound. Eli rose, rifle ready, his heart hammering. He waited until the figure stepped into the moonlight and froze. It was Chief Kosa alone. The Apache leader stopped 20 paces from the porch and raised his hands, palms open, not in surrender, but in truce. Eli hesitated, then lowered the barrel slightly. "You're either the bravest man I ever met, or the craziest," he said quietly. Kosa's face was unreadable. "Both," he said. His voice was calm, deep, carrying the weight of centuries of dust and blood. "You lie this morning." "I knew." Eli's stomach tightened. "Then why didn't you kill me?" "Because," Kosa said, "mercy is rare. My daughter told me long ago, white man's heart is made of iron. Maybe she wrong." Eli blinked. "Your daughter." He turned toward the cabin, realization dawning. "You knew she was alive." The chief nodded slowly. "When sun rose, I felt her. Blood knows blood." He took a step closer. "She is all that remains of my family. Soldiers took my sons. The earth took my wife. I would have taken your life, but she would not want that." Eli exhaled slowly. "Then take her back. She's yours." Kosa looked past him, toward the cabin window where Taya's shadow trembled behind the curtain. "She cannot return. She broke our circle when she crossed into your world." Apache do not forgive easily, not even their own. The air between them went still. Eli lowered his eyes. "So what now?" Kosa's gaze softened just a flicker. "You keep her safe. Teach her your peace, if you have any left. And if your soldiers come again," his voice hardened, "you send them south. I will meet them myself." He turned, the moonlight tracing silver across the feathers in his hair. "You showed mercy, rancher. The desert remembers such things." Then, without another word, he melted back into the darkness, leaving only footprints in the dust. Eli stood there long after he was gone, feeling the chill settle into his bones. Inside, Taya wept softly, not from fear, but from something older, deeper in that moment. Eli understood. Mercy was never free. It always came with a price. Morning came soft and gray, the kind of dawn that didn't bring warmth, only light. The desert stretched quiet and endless, washed clean by the cool breath of night. For the first time in days, There were no war drums, no riders, no smoke on the horizon. Staring toward the hills where Chief Kosa had disappeared hours earlier, the wind tugged at his coat, carrying the scent of sage and the faint memory of smoke. Inside the cabin, Taya sat at the table, a wool blanket around her shoulders. The fever was gone, replaced by a calm that didn't belong to someone her age. She looked stronger now, but her eyes had the weight of an entire people in them. Eli stepped in quietly. "He's gone," he said. "Your father," she nodded slowly. "He always gone." Even when near, Eli poured coffee into 2 tin cups, sliding one across the table. She accepted it, hands trembling slightly from the chill. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the small fire and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, Taya said softly, "You should not have helped me." Eli raised a brow. "I keep hearing that. You change path," she continued. "Apache and white man, their roads do not cross. When they do, both bleed." Eli took a sip of coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, and looked out the window. "Maybe so, but I reckon there's enough blood in this land already." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "You talk like my father," he chuckled quietly. I doubt he'd agree. They fell into silence again, comfortable this time. But as the light grew stronger, Taya's eyes drifted toward the open desert. Something restless flickered behind them. "You're thinking about going back," Eli said. It wasn't a question. She hesitated, then nodded. "My people need to know I live. If I stay, more will come. Soldiers, warriors, all searching. If they find me here, they kill you, too." Eli leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. "You sure that's what you want? Out there's no promise but dust and ghosts." She met his gaze. "That is where I belong," he wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that peace was possible here, that the world didn't have to be split between white and red, between vengeance and forgiveness. But he knew better. The West didn't work that way. It never had. By noon, the mare was saddled. Eli packed what supplies he could spare: bread, jerky, a water skin, and an old blanket. He helped her mount, steadying her as she adjusted the reins. The sky was the color of burnished gold. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry echoing across the basin like a farewell. Tai looked down at him. "Eli Turner," she said softly, "one day you will ride east. You will see Greenland again. When you do, remember, the desert does not hate. It only tests." He smiled faintly. "And if I ever see your father again," her eyes shone, "tell him his daughter found her peace, not with war, but with mercy." She turned the mare toward the open desert. Eli watched her ride until she was nothing but a shadow in the light. One more ghost carried by the wind. The ranch felt impossibly quiet afterward. The dust swirled around his boots. The boards creaked in the heat. But somewhere in that silence, something had changed. He walked to the edge of the corral, eyes fixed on the far hills. For the first time in years, the land didn't feel empty. It felt alive, as if it had finally forgiven him. Eli tipped his hat to the horizon. "Ride safe, kid," he whispered. And then the wind carried her name across the plains one last time, Taya.